Hello, welcome to the School Safety Free Period. I'm Amanda Klinger,
And I'm Dr. Amy Klinger.
and we're with the Educators School Safety Network. We're a nonprofit, and we provide school safety training and resources and technical assistance to schools. And then every 2 weeks, hopefully, or every week, or hopefully as often as we can remember, we do this School Safety Free Period podcast. And we have a little bit of a less structured, slightly less academic discussion about what we're finding in our work, what we're hearing from folks just like you, and hopefully providing some additional information and tips and tricks and all that kind of discussion about school safety. So welcome.
Welcome, everyone. We're back.
So today, I think we wanted to talk about, the reason that we didn't have a podcast last week. We have been traveling so much, and at the beginning of the school year, we tend to do a lot of professional development for school districts as they're getting back to school. And then as soon as that finishes up, we transition into doing a lot of comprehensive school safety assessments or vulnerability assessments for schools. And so I think we wanted to talk a little bit about some of the things that we tend to find and what is valuable, what school districts report to us, what they find to be valuable about the assessments. So do you want to kind of start about why we do them and why people ask us to do them and what, the kind of the value that people tend to express in having them conducted?
Well, I think the overarching theme, if you will, of vulnerability assessments is you don't know what you don't know.
Yeah.
And so you can stand in an area and go, yeah, looks good to me. But oftentimes objective or a fresh set of eyes come in with really specific kind of viewpoints. And it really uncovers some very interesting things, not just about your facility, but I think more importantly, about the student experience, about the climate and culture, about the way that people interact in the facility and the way that people use the space. So I think that's really sort of the overarching idea. I think the other thing that's really critical is to change our thinking a little bit away from the idea of a vulnerability assessment or a site survey. Oh, that's where you go jiggle all the doorknobs and see if the doors are locked. I mean, that's a small part of it, but it's not the same thing as what your local police department might come in and do and walk around and go, yeah, this gate's open, or those kind of things. So I think it's really important to shift away from that to more of looking at what are the people that work here every day or that come here every day, what do they experience?
Yeah, I think you raise a couple of really important points in terms of like the purpose and the outcome of a comprehensive, school safety assessment. We do look at facilities, and I think having a look at your facilities and how your facilities function is important because, like you said, teachers and school leaders walk by the same thing 40 times a day, every school day of the year, and so you become kind of the joke, about being nose blind to your own home. You become, potentially school safety blind to the things that you walk by all the time. So that's important. But I think what you mentioned about the way that the school is being used and the procedures, the daily operating procedures. And one of the things that we really try to look out for is there a discrepancy between what we say we do, what we have written down, what our policy indicates, or what our leadership thinks happens and what actually happens on a daily basis. And if there is a discrepancy, and of course, this is not people trying to get away with something. This is not anybody being, ill-intentioned. This is just the natural course of things. We set out to have a good habit. We do this in our lives, right? You set out to have a good habit, and then everything else gets in the way. So the safety assessments can be a really good opportunity to look at, is there a discrepancy between what we hope we're doing, what we intend to do, and what actually happens on a daily basis?
I think the other thing that we see a lot that is maybe a little more self-reflective people can think about is we look at, are we doing this thing in this school because it's convenient for adults or because it's good for kids? And that's why the wrestling room stands unlocked all day long, because it's more convenient for adults, but it's not necessarily good for kids. And frankly, you can apply that metric to a lot of things of what we're doing academically, interpersonal relationship wise, safety wise. But that's a kind of another overarching theme. I think the big takeaway, though, is when we go to a school and we do a walkthrough and we have the perspective of emergency responders and educators and
Mhm.
attorneys with liability and all these different perspectives, you really get a picture of some really common themes that you sort of see everywhere in terms of access control, how secured things are, the level of supervision, the way that people engage with visitors, the way that rooms are set up. So all of these different things, not just about, is a door locked. All of these different things give you a much bigger overview of what's going on in the building and what some of the potential vulnerabilities are. And then that focus on climate and culture and the student experience really gives you some valuable insight on what it's like to be a student there every day.
Yeah. I think, when we conduct the assessments, we bring a multidisciplinary team, but we're really specific about that it is not to get people in trouble. The assessments are not a gotcha, they're not an audit. It is to have an understanding of what is the case here on a normal typical day. And that information is not used, to punitive or to point fingers. It's what is, and if that's not where we want to be, how do we get there? And how do we prioritize that work? And how do we prioritize that mitigation? And so, when we conduct the assessments, we bring a whole big team and we're there and we're all over the facilities and we spend a lot of time really examining things. And I think maybe it would be helpful for us to talk a little bit for folks. Maybe you're not in a position to be able to have a complete, comprehensive assessment conducted. And so maybe what are some things that we typically find and we typically see that maybe people could sort of do a self-assessment and think about, if I was looking, really closely in my school, would I observe some of the same things? Yeah. So I'll go first because I have one.
I think one of the reasons that when we do the big ones where we bring in our team, is we spend a lot of time documenting either through quantitative data or through photographs, documenting what we're finding, because there is always this sort of normalcy bias of, oh, I don't think that we do such a bad job of that. And then when you really start looking at it with fresh eyes, you see those things. And I think that's why, regardless of whether you're doing it yourself, just as a lone individual, you can really kind of look at things and go, oh, wow. One of the things that I would say you should take a look at in your school is trip hazards. We see so many evacuation hazards where you have a classroom and you have 25 book bags and they're all laying on the floor, and the cords are going across from the smart board to the projector, and the cubbies or the laptop cart is right up against the door. And you have this kind of perfect storm where maybe in the moment as you're in that space, that's the way it has to be. But if you had to rapidly evacuate that room, you would have a lot of obstacles to a rapid evacuation, not just for an active shooter, but really for anything. And so that's the one that I think we see all the time, that I would suggest you stand in your classroom in the middle of a lesson and freeze and just pause and just take a look around. If we were all running to the exit or moving quickly to the exit right now, what would happen? And I think you would be shocked at what you would see.
And I think the sometimes the pushback is, well, we manage to leave this room every day because we go to music or we change periods. And that's true. In a normal, everything is fine, everybody can squeeze past. And the question is, what would that look like in a panic? What would that look like in an emergency? What would that look like in a hurry? And have we, put unnecessary hurdles or unnecessary obstacles in our way to be able to be successful in a atypical or scary or panicked situation? That's a great one. I was going to say, you mentioned access control earlier. And when we do assessments and when we conduct those, we look at access control, both sort of the external of people being able to get into the school building. And that's a really good one to look at in terms of, we think we have a single point of entry. In theory, everyone has to go in, but we know the reality is this door is always propped open, or people are always letting each other in here because it's so much more convenient. So to look at that part, but we also look at access control within the building. So I'm here, I'm a student, or I'm a visitor, or I'm someone who got in for whatever reason. What are the things that are unsecured and unused? And you mentioned, the wrestling room. We were doing an assessment last week, and there was a door that was supposed to be locked. It had a padlock, like it's supposed to be locked, but it wasn't locked. And so once you got past that, you were able to get into all of these sort of unofficial looking areas that were adjacent to performing arts, and they were really old basement type areas, and you had indications that students are there on occasion. I did my best Sherlock Holmes impression and found a Doritos wrapper with a 2023 expiration date. So that means someone has been there, but yet there was stuff everywhere, and there were fall hazards, and so it's clearly not an official area. People aren't supposed to be there, but people are able to access it. And so that's something that I would be willing to bet that the principal had no idea that people were accessing it. And what does that mean from a accident? Someone goes back there and trips and falls and no one knows to look for them. What does that mean from you mentioned, the climate and culture, the student experience? What does that feel like to a student that I can climb into these old rooms and no one finds me and no one looks for me? It's as simple as, if it's supposed to be locked, it has to be locked all the time. And so that kind of looking at that, and that's something that would be really easy if we talk about, being nose blind to your own environment. A door that's supposed to be locked, and I walk by and it looks locked, but it's not. And so that's something that that you can have a look at in the things that you walk by all the time. And I presume this is locked, but is it? And do we really have good procedures for that?
The one that I would suggest, that's probably a fairly low bar also, is just show up for school a few minutes early and just watch your arrival or your dismissal. But not from the perspective of, I've got stuff to do, I'm a busy teacher, I got things to do, I got to get set up, I got to get the seat work ready, I got to get this, but from the perspective of sort of that detachment of just watching what's happening during arrival. And it's really interesting for us to watch, because there is this desire on the part of parents, regardless of the age of the student, to have this assurance of safety. So my kid got out of the car. I am either going to sit there until they go into the building, or I'm going to sit there until I see a handoff, as in the sense, I see somebody official. I see someone that's going to make sure my kid gets in there. And when you start looking at how that works into traffic flow and the impatience of people and kids getting out of cars and froggering across a couple lanes of traffic, and the traffic jam, and the buses can't get out, and the people supersede the process, and they start dropping off kids outside of the zones, and you have all of this stuff that happens in this really compressed time, like maybe a 10-minute window where it's just, in many cases, total chaos for just that brief amount of time. And you may never see it as a staff member because you're safely inside welcoming kids that are walking into your classroom. But I really encourage you to take a look at that, because that's one of the biggest vulnerabilities we see is how chaotic and dangerous that little window of time is, mostly in arrival, but also in the early parts of dismissal.
I think that's an excellent point. And, it reminds me of the one that you previously said about evacuation hazards and trip hazards. Yes, normally on a normal day, people have arrival, and luckily, fingers crossed, most places there haven't been catastrophic accident. Your school probably hasn't had a catastrophic accident at arrival. But when we observe these, you can sort of see that we have stacked the deck against ourselves. And we are there's sometimes I watch some of these arrivals and just feel like lucky. Like I just feel lucky and grateful that something bad, large or small, I mean, even a small thing, we feel lucky that something bad hasn't happened. And so what does it look like to sort of unstack the deck against us, I guess, to sort of extend that
because
metaphor?
Arrival and dismissal is sort of the place where I think that you're rolling the dice the most, where you're sort of, you're allowing things to just sort of happen with where people are really very oblivious to what's happening, and then you mix in one particular factor. It's a little bit icy, or it's
Yeah.
dark, or
Foggy. Even,
somebody
yeah.
unfamiliar is dropping off a kid and they're
Yeah.
driving the wrong way. So you put all of these different things into play, and it really becomes, like you said, kind of a crapshoot in terms of how is this going to go. You're talking about it from a traffic control and the safety of students issue. I'm also thinking of that as a huge vulnerability when there is no one from the school that is there to take the temperature of
Yeah.
what's happening as people come in. A kid who's coming in really agitated or really upset or acting really suspiciously, or a parent who's acting in a way that's very different.
Yeah.
When there's nobody there to sort of pre-screen, if you will, or take a look at the way that people are approaching the building as they're coming in, you're missing a valuable opportunity to diffuse or to intervene in something, and you're allowing it to get into the building and really potentially become a big vulnerability.
Yeah. So if you head to the website, we have a lot of resources. We have a lot of information about comprehensive school safety assessments. We have a couple of resources of talking about what makes a good vulnerability assessment. We have some information about that. I think a good first step is to just sort of, like you recommended, of come a couple minutes early and try to look with the fresh set of eyes. Or, when you're the next time you walk an errand that you do, to go, I think that door is supposed to be locked. Is it really? Or that your exterior door is supposed to shut automatically with the hydraulic closer. If I push it open, does it really shut all the way, or does it not exactly latch? So even some of those really small, micro assessments can be really valuable, and you'll start to see more of the world around you, I guess. You'll start to look at stuff with a little bit of a fresh set of eyes yourself. If you have any questions or anything that we can do to help, the website is www.eschoolsafety.org, and the email address is info@eschoolsafety.org. You started to say something. Go ahead.
Well, I was going to say, talking about what you were taught with individuals, I think you have to trust your instinct. We hear a
Yeah.
lot from people when we do these assessments, somebody going, I always wondered about that door, or I
Yeah.
always felt uncomfortable with students standing around before we get here, or whatever that thing is that your gut is telling you doesn't seem right, probably isn't right. And so,
Yeah.
I don't tell that inner voice to be quiet. Listen to it.
Yeah, and I think that's an excellent point. And one kind of final thought, when we do conduct these assessments, we provide mitigation recommendations. And sometimes there's a thing that we don't feel great about, but it is the best of all possible options. And that's okay. But oftentimes we find stuff, and why is it like that? Well, it's like that because that's how we've always kind of done it, and we've never really examined it and looked at it. So I think your recommendation of sort of trusting your gut, that doesn't mean that whatever you're trusting your gut has to be wrong, has to be fixed, but it's worth examining. It's certainly worth it taking a second look at, and really making sure that we're being intentional in the things that are happening,
And
not
it's not just
accidental.
an administrative exercise. The
Yeah.
people that really know what's going on in the building, or really can identify those concerns, are the people in the trenches that are interacting with the building and with the kids every
Mhm.
day, in other job responsibilities other than a decision maker.
Yeah. Well, do you have anything else to add, or I don't know if you had anything funny and irreverent to say today. I feel like this was
Well,
very serious.
one time we found chickens in a building, I recall.
There you go. We should talk about our best finds.
Yeah, the chickens were good, in a VOAG space, which,
But they were
I
like
guess
loose. My understanding is one of our evaluators opened the door and there were chickens, not in cages, not in coops, just
the
tooling about.
chickens were running the VOAG department.
Yeah.
So that was one that you don't expect. I don't know that I have a best one, other than I just think that, when we do these, it's so interesting to see, the way that people interact with the environment, and what kids experience. And
Mhm.
mine is not funny, but Mine, I think, is some really great advice that I don't remember where I read it somewhere, but it was outside of a school. But essentially, the idea was to put yourself in the shoes of the people you're trying to serve
Mm-hmm.
and see what their experience is like.
Mm-hmm.
So if you followed a kid around all day long in your building and you sat next to them, what would your experience be like? What would you see? What would you look around
Mm-hmm.
and look at this overwhelming amount of stuff, which maybe we'll talk about in another podcast, or this thing that doesn't work, or this area that feels unsafe, or whatever that might be. So I think that's probably the big takeaway is like what does the third grader see all day, or what does that freshman feel like all day?
Yeah. That's great. That's a great takeaway. Well, I think you're correct. I think this is something we should revisit because there's a lot to unpack here in the things that we observe and what we hear from folks, what they observe in their own buildings when they're trying to have a look at this stuff. So I think this is definitely one for us to revisit. If you have questions, if you go back into your own building and you have a look and something jumps out at you, you can always shoot us an email, info@eschoolsafety.org. And like I said, there's lots of information and resources and information about comprehensive school safety assessments, vulnerability assessments on the website, www.eschoolsafety.org. So I guess until next time, thanks, and we'll be back soon.
Bye.
Bye.